Okay. So what I want to do is I want to discuss a certain idea, which is the idea of the way to study something. The way to understand something through Chokhmah is basically a way of determining what the structure is. Every Chokhmah has components, has certain ideas and so on, and these ideas have a certain relationship. And the relationship between ideas is called its structure and so on. But a structure exists in a hierarchical way. There's something called a macro structure, and there's something called a microstructure or a mini structure. In other words, at different levels, a chokhmah has different ideas in a different structure, and they constitute what's called the inner necessity. You know, one structure is actually caused by another structure, which is more intrinsic. Now, the most important structure of all are the macro structures. That's the structure of all the ideas together, how they relate to each other, and their contribution to the whole chokhmah. And a macro structure is like, for example, if you're in a forest, when you're inside a forest, you can only see the trees. You cannot see anything else. And so therefore, the only structure that's available to you is the structure of seeing the trees. But what happens if that forest is part of a larger geographical area? In other words, that forest is actually one section of a geographical area that includes a mountain area. There are mountains. It includes also a desert area. It includes a desert, and includes certain lands, agricultural areas, certain lands, and soil. So then what you have the structure of that this geographical area is really composed of 4 different areas. It's composed of an area of forest. It has an area called mountains. It has an area called a desert, and then it has an area called hills, and fundamentally earth. All these areas together, all 4 of these areas together, make up the sum total of the geography of that particular geography. Now, when you study something, what is the best way to do it? To first determine all the total areas of that geography, and then as you've studied the total areas, you look at the major areas of that geography, and you see their relationship, how they are related to each other in terms of their position. And then you begin to go down into the geography, into the land, and you begin to study the details of each area. So you'll go into the forest, and you'll study the details of the forest, the details of the mountain area, its structure, the details of the desert area, and the details of the plains and the hills. So in other words, the first thing you should do, first do you study the details? You go from the forest to the mountain area, to the desert, and to the plains. Which direction you go? Do you go to the macro area, which is the sum total of all the components, and then you go down into details of each component, or do you? That's called going from top to bottom.
Okay.
Or do you first go to the bottom? In other words, you first collect all the details, and then you determine what the structure is at the top. You know, it's like taking a helicopter. Do you start the helicopter ride from above, and you see the areas of the whole geography, and then you slowly go into the details of each area, or do you determine the macro by studying the details. Well, the best way to do it is to study not the details, to go from bottom up, but to go from top down. So structures should first be studied in terms of a macro structure, all the main areas that comprise the entire geography, and then slowly move towards the details where you see the relationship of ideas in the details. So the best way to study something is to go into this kind of, first, the overall structure, the highest overall structure of the Chokhmah, and then go down into the details. Few people study that way. Most of the people studying the Chokhmah go from the details. They manage to collect all the details and try and put them together. They try to determine what the structure of all the details are, and then hopefully they'll see the total geography. But that's a very laborious, it's called a linear type of structure, where people are moving from one detail to another until finally they're able to grasp what the total area looks like. But the best way to study something is to go to the total area first, to take a helicopter in a certain sense above all the geographical areas and see the components or what derives from the whole area. And that's, in a certain sense, what we've been trying to do with Hashkafa, what we're trying to do with the knowledge of why God created the world and what he does with it. We're trying to see the most fundamental ideas and then go down into the details. But that's a very difficult thing to do. But we have succeeded in a certain level in doing it. Because when you study Kabbalah, the details of the Kabbalah, you see, you're mostly focused on the spheros. You're focused on the spheros and the olamas. You know, in the world of what? The world of Shimon and the Kav, the world of Adam Kadmon, Atzilas, the world of Bria, Yetzirah and Asiya. You're focused on the worlds, and you're focused on the spheres which is contained in each of the worlds. But the question is that the true picture? Is that the real picture of the total geography? Are you looking at the geography from its totality, from all its components merged together in a certain relationship? Or not really? So that's why we saw that the wider structure does not focus on the spheres and the olamas, on the worlds. It focuses on the Zulu Say and the Ein Sof. Fundamentally, the central idea of the Kabbalah that we've seen up to now is the Zulu Say itself. He is the central part of the whole picture. He is the one that God creates and that God wants to change in a certain sense. So he's masakin the problem of Deksufah. So in other words, the main idea of all of Kabbalah is really the Zulu Say, the problem of Deksufah, and the concept of the tikkun of Deksufah. That's really the totality, the largest totality which exists in Kabbalah. The Kabbalah does not consist of a study of the spheres. It's considered a study of the Zulu Say. That's really where it starts. And suddenly the entire picture changes. Now, I hope everyone understands what I'm saying. But studying a certain chokhmah, a certain discipline, requires a certain direction. The direction of studying a chokhmah is always from the top to see the totality of all the components, to the bottom to see the details of each component. It is not the other way around, to first study all the details, right? And then eventually get to the total structure of the whole geography. It's not to do that. But that's very difficult. It's very difficult to get the total geography first before the details. Usually you have to accumulate the details and then formulate what the total structure looks like. In a jigsaw puzzle, when you're given, let's say, 100 pieces in a jigsaw puzzle, what they give you are the details. They give you each component, each element first, all the details, 100 details. each detail is a picture, a piece of the picture of the whole. So what you're given are the details, and you're asked to formulate the whole picture from the details. That's difficult and so on. So the real skill of learning a discipline, learning a chokhmah, is to be able to see the total area from as few details as possible. And that's the definition of real study. The goal is to try and see the whole picture first, and then gradually the details. But you can't see the whole picture first, because all you have is the details. So therefore, what you're supposed to do is try and formulate as much of the total picture from the least amount of details that you're given. That's the general method to do that. So in Kabbalah, we move from the details, which are the spheres, all the 10 spheres and the olamas, and how they develop and so on. But Kabbalah remains at that level of details. It doesn't really go up, because when you get up, you suddenly have a whole different picture. And the picture that we've developed in this entire time is the picture where these spheres are really a certain form that the Zulu Say takes. That the Zulu Say could be either in the form of the spheres, or it's not in the form of the spheres, or rather in the form of the spheres, or what you're studying is the Zulu Say, but the focus is the Zulu Say, and that's what we're doing. But what I'm trying to do today is form another macro picture. I believe we have enough information to begin to form the next macro picture, the picture which is above the picture of the Zulu Say. That's right. The Kabbalah does not end, or the Hashkafa does not end with the Zulu Say. There's actually a higher picture, a higher structure, a higher totality of this thing. And above that, there's another structure, another macro structure. So in other words, we really see that we are not confined to the spheres. That's kind of the smallest level of what to talk about. But that the Kabbalah and the Hashkafa is concerned with material which is above the spheres. Now, we saw that the study of the Zulu Say is above the spheres. The spheres only constitute one part of the study of the Zulu Say. So therefore, we discovered that the existence of the Zulu Say, the recipient of Olam Haba, even before Simpson. The first action in Kabbalah is Simpson. And it sounds like that's the beginning of Kabbalah. But Simpson is not the first act of Kabbalah. The first act of Kabbalah, in a certain sense, is God, Atzmusai, and God creating, or not creating, really derivating, a malbush called the Ein Sof. And then the Ein Sof derives a certain malbush, a certain appearance called the Zulu Say. So we see that Kabbalah really includes concepts which are above the Zulu Say itself. And therefore we determined from this that the structure of Kabbalah contains a pre-Simpson phase. In other words, Kabbalah does not start with Simpson. You see it. It really starts with a phase called pre-Simpson, where you're only dealing with three entities: Atzmusai, God as He is; the Ein Sof, God as He appears; and finally the Zulu Say. And when you're looking at all three of these things, you're really looking at a macro picture, a higher picture of the geography of Hashkafa than normally you would see. But I believe that we're merging everything, and we're slowly seeing details that actually conform to a macro structure above the Zulu Say. And the question is, what is that? In other words, there's a more central idea of the Zulu Say than we realize, even though the Zulu Say is a central idea. But there's something that goes beyond the Zulu Say that encompasses the whole Kabbalah. And we question about what is that? So I would like to talk about that today, about the macro structure, which is above the details of the Zulu Say and the olamas and the spheres. And what could that be? when we look at the concept of the Atzmusai, God as He is, we see that there's a certain fundamental principle that covers this concept. We understand that we cannot truly comprehend Atzmusai, God. Why? Because He and His existence are absolutely one. His existence is not outside of His essence. His existence is actually included in His essence. So therefore, He is Himself. There are no two things. There's absolutely no duality in Atzmusai, in the sense that there's only one thing called Atzmusai. And we realize that this is the ultimate configuration of what God is. So therefore, this is contained in the principle, Ein Oid Milvadoi. There is nothing outside of God. There is no reality outside of God, and so on and so forth. There's absolutely no reality outside of God, and so on. And that's even more strongly contained in the idea of not Ein Oid Milvadoi, but I believe in the idea of Ein Oid. The expression that really talks about the unity of God is not only there is no one but God, because that seems to imply that there's a possibility that there could be someone but God, but there isn't. But we're not talking about a possibility even. So therefore the term, the phrase, Ein Od, there is nothing else, is the highest phrase that one can use to describe God. There is absolutely nothing else, nor can there be anything else besides God. He is the only thing that can exist, because His existence is a process which is identical to His essence. And God really doesn't have an essence. He cannot be defined. He cannot be understood. He has no borders. He is beyond the Ein Sof. The Ein Sof is simply an appearance of God that is not in concept. It's beyond concept. And of course, we cannot imagine anything which is outside of concept. But there's something beyond the Ein Sof. Because even though the Ein Sof does not exist in the world of concept, because it has no edge, it has no gavul, it has no border, so we have nothing to hold on to it. So therefore, we cannot understand what the Ein Sof is. The Ein Sof means the words, there is no end. It means that there's no edge, there's no border. There's no conceptual border that describes the Ein Sof. So that the Ein Sof is beyond any kind of understanding or thought. But Atzmusai is even beyond that. In other words, Atzmusai is beyond the concept of border or no border. The Ein Sof can be defined negatively. The Zulu Say is defined as a Yesh Sof, that which has a border, that which has a feature, that which has a characteristic, and therefore can be understood. But the Ein Sof doesn't have any characteristics at all. It doesn't have any characteristics that can be identified. So it's on a higher level. So therefore we have to define the Ein Sof in a negative way. What do we say? We say the Zulu Say is a Yesh Sof. He can be submitted to concepts. But the Ein Sof has no conceptual nature. He cannot be understood. So that's all we know about the Ein Sof, that it is defined negatively. There is no concept about the Ein Sof. But what about Atzmusai, who's even before the Ein Sof? The answer is that Atzmusai has nothing to do with the whole area of concepts, whether you possess it or you don't possess it. It doesn't make a difference if you are a Yesh Sof or you are an Ein Sof. Atzmusai has nothing to do with the notion of concept, either in its presence or either in its absence. Now then, what does it have to do with? We have no idea what it has to do with, nor will we ever have an idea, because it is even beyond the notion of the absence of concepts. So therefore, Atzmusai precedes the Ein Sof. So we have understanding of this. Now, why would we mention all of this? Because there's a certain feature of the Ein Sof That's a result of his of his nature, even though he doesn't have a nature. I mean, the Ein Sof does not have a nature truly, but it has somewhat because it's considered Ritzonai, it's considered will. So it has the aspect of will. But Atzmusai doesn't even have the aspect of will. So it's beyond anything that we can conceive of. But there's one thing about Atzmusai that's absolutely true because of the way it is. And that's called a Yichud Pressure. And what does that mean? It's not simply that Atzmusai simply is beyond anything that we can have any concept. We can have no concept or no negative concept. It's totally beyond the notion of concept. And therefore, nothing can exist outside of it. It includes everything in himself. What that does, it creates a certain Yichud Pressure. The unity of Atzmusai is so great that there's nothing else that can exist. Literally, nothing can exist but Atzmusai, because the nature of Atzmusai is existence and essence. It's a combination of both. So therefore, there's nothing outside of Atzmusai. This creates a Yichud Pressure. A Yichud Pressure meaning what? It means nothing else can exist but the Atzmusai. That's an actual pressure. The Yichud of Atzmusai is so great that it does not allow anything outside of it. Even a reality, there's no reality outside of the Ein Sof. The Ein Sof is a subject which has no relationship to anything called reality. And that's a certain pressure. The Atzmusai, I'm not referring to the Ein Sof, I'm referring to Atzmusai. Atzmusai has such an aspect of unity. It is so profoundly unified that there's nothing else but Atzmusai. Therefore, this exerts a pressure on the outside. There is no outside. There cannot be an outside. This is called the Yichud Pressure, and so on. Now, what the Ein Sof decided to do, you see it, and we do not really know why, or I should say, I'm sorry, I keep on saying Ein Sof when I should say Atzmusai. Atzmusai decided to do, and it doesn't have any will, so it decided to create something which is somewhat outside, or can be considered as if it was outside, although it is absolutely not. And that's called the Zulu Say. The Zulu Say is the entity of a self that is aware of itself as if it was outside of Atzmusai. And Atzmusai decided to derive this being called the Zulu Say from itself. But the fact that Atzmusai cannot have a being outside of itself creates a certain pressure that it's impossible to have something else besides Atzmusai. So therefore, the question is, how does the Atzmusai maintain an entity called Zulu Say if there's a pressure against its possibility of existing? And the answer is that in some way, we don't know how, it maintains the existence of Zulu Say, even though it slightly appears to be outside of Atzmusai, because it has a self-identity. It knows itself. It says the word me. And in saying the word me, it sees itself as slightly outside of Atzmusai. So therefore, that self-identity of the Zulu Say refers to Atzmusai as you. So the Zulu Say, when it's aware of itself, thinks of me, and then it thinks of you being Atzmusai, and me being the Zulu Say. Now this exists, the Zulu Say exists, even though there's a Yichud Pressure to annihilate it, to get rid of it, because there's nothing that can exist with any type of awareness of its identity, So how does it exist and so on? The answer is it exists through a midah of atzmusoi called Hesed. Well, Hesed is not a midah really of atzmusoi. Atzmusoi has no midos. It has no characteristics. It has no nature. It has nothing that we can attribute it to. You see it? All we know about atzmusoi is the notion of its Yichud Pressure, that it will reject and annihilate anything which even appears to be outside of it or outside of it, and so on and so forth, or beyond it. There is nothing beyond it. So the Yichud Pressure wants to annihilate and reject any possibility of a being outside of it. So how does it create the Zulu Say, which seems to have an identity outside of the Zulu of Atzmusoi? How does it do that? Well, we have no idea. But the way it does it is by creating another appearance. It creates a malbush, or like a clothes, like a suit, which it wears. The Atzmusoi wears a suit called Ein Sof. The Ein Sof does have a will. It's called Ritzonoi. And the fact that it has a will, it suddenly it can be created along with Zulu Say. And this is what happened. But the action of creating the Zulu Say, in that sense, is called Hesed. Hesed means that you are creating something, or not really creating, you are deriving something from yourself for no other reason than simply you want to do it. And that's called love. The ability to create a Zulu Say from Atzmusoi is done through love. It's fundamentally done through love. But the Yichud Pressure which exists on the Zulu Say is real. So therefore, Atzmusoi, in a certain way, we don't understand how it does it, but it has, Hesed allows it to exert us a counter pressure. In order for the Zulu Say to exist, it has to be an effect, a result of a counter pressure of the Yichud pressure. How this is done, we have no idea. The concept of Hesed is so high. It's a concept which comes from Atzmusoi as it appears in the form of the Ein Sof. And in that case, what happens is the Yichud Pressure of Atzmusoi against anything else is suddenly temporarily blocked. It's temporarily suspended so that Zulu Say can exist, even though it has some kind of manifestation as if it was outside. And the ability to do this is called Hesed. That's what Hesed is. It's a tremendous ability to create something outside which cannot exist, yet it does exist. Because of the will of Atzmusoi, or I should say, because of the will of the Ein Sof, which is the will, the Ratzon of Atzmusoi. But there's another feature. And that feature is called, is another feature of Atzmusoi, which is true. And that feature is called, it cannot change. Atzmusoi cannot change. There's a pasuk in the Nevi'im that says, Ani Hashem, I am God, and it's referring to really Atzmusoi, and it says, Lo Shonisi, I do not change. It's impossible for me to change. I am the absolute constant of my awareness. My awareness of myself is an absolute constant and cannot change. It does not have the property of fluidity. Fluid means the ability to change, like water, fluidity. And fluidity represents the concept of changing. And God says, Ani Hashem lo shonisi. He says to us, it's not that I do not change. No, I cannot change. My essence is a totally constant and fixed. You see it? I cannot change. But what I can do, I can fix the problem of the Zulu Say in the sense of the Yichud Pressure on the Zulu Say. because I exert a Yichud pressure on the Zulu Say to reject it, you see it, I have to allow the possibility for the Zulu Say to change. So I have to create that possibility that it can change so that it eventually avoids the issue of the Yichud pressure. And this issue is called Deksufah. The flaw in the Zulu Say, in the sense that it exists someone outside, it appears to exist through its self-identity, someone outside of the Atzmusai, is only a fiction, but that's its appearance, and that therefore it is the subject of this Yichud pressure. And this problem, this issue is called Deksufah, where when the Zulu Say sees Atzmusai, or in whatever way it understands that, it says me, you. The Atzmusai is a figure of you, and the Zulu Say is the figure of me. So Deksufah is the issue which has to be cured. It has to be healed. Why? Because of the Yichud pressure of Atzmusai on the Zulu Say. God is an absolute subject. He tolerates no other subject. And that's the main feature of Einoid Movadoi. Atzmusai, which is God himself, cannot, through his being, tolerate any other type of subject who's self-aware of himself. So Atzmusai cannot tolerate the existence of a Zulu Say. So it exerts a pressure. It suspends this pressure through a midah called Hesed. It suspends that pressure. But that's what it has to do to allow the Zulu Say to survive. But it does something in addition. It says, I cannot change, but I will create the concept of change, fluidity, as it applies to the Zulu Say. That's what it does. So what it does is begins to create the possibility of change. So this is a major concept, the notion of change and no change. In other words, when you look at Atzmusai, you are not only looking at a Yichud pressure, but you are looking at the impossibility that any change can take place in the Atzmusai, and therefore no change is possible in existence. But the Zulu Say has to change to remove the Yichud pressure, and it does so through the act of love. God gives the Zulu Say certain mitzvahs, and it gives it the choice to listen to the Atzmusai in doing these mitzvahs, and thereby creating a mood of love to Atzmusai. In doing that, the love sees Atzmusai as part of himself. He does not see Atzmusai as outside of himself. So therefore, he changes the configuration, he changes his awareness to include Atzmusai in himself. And that's why God says in Olam Haba to the Zulu Say, I am you. I'm not outside of you. I am you. I am not a you. I am part of me. I am an inner me. But the Atzmusai has to create the possibility of the tikkun of Deksufah, where he can remove the flaw that's subject to the concept of Yichud pressure. And this ability to create the possibility of change in the Zulu Say is called Din. That's the concept of Din. The concept of Din means that the Zulu Say can change himself, and he can become what he changed. That's the concept. This has to be created because no change is possible at all. First of all, there's no outside of Atzmusai. And and not only that, there's no possibility of change in that which is outside of Atzmusai because of the Yichud pressure, which then annihilates it. So what the Atzmusai wants to do is to save the Zulu Say by allowing it to change, by giving it a certain possibility of a fluidity. And this is a very deep concept. How does Atzmusoi create the possibility of change? Well, it creates the possibility through its appearance as an Ein Sof. Because the Ein Sof is the will of God, it represents the concept of change. It represents the mechanism of change. It represents the mechanism of the navigation of change. So the essence of the Ein Sof is that God suddenly appears in a form which allows the Zulu Say to change. That's why the Ein Sof was created. The Ein Sof was not created, but it's derived. The Ein Sof is a malbush of the Atzmusai. Why did God derive this malbush or this appearance of Atzmusai? Atzmusai appears as the Ein Sof, and in that appearance, it allows change to occur to the Zulu Say. And that's the whole reason why Ein Sof was derived. So that the Zulu Say can gradually attain the possibility of being somewhat, could maintain its possibility of being a self-identity, feeling on some level that it's outside. Because what God says in Olam Haba, I am you. I am not outside of you. I am you. I'm your inner me. I am not a you, and you are not a me. You are a me, and I am your inner me. But I will allow your sense of self, your sense of being separate and individual to be retained. And you will therefore feel like, owning your own perception, that I am not outside of you, that on a certain level I am not you. So therefore I represent a contradiction in your awareness. I am not you, and at the same time, I am you, because there's nothing outside of me, and at the same time, I am not you. Why? Because I will allow you, I will tolerate the existence of a self-identity, the concept of me in you, so you actually think that you're outside of me. So I will tolerate this contradiction in Olam Haba. So therefore we realize what Olam Haba is. Olam Haba basically represents a contradiction. God says to you, I am you, and he says to you, but you are not me. That's a contradiction. But yet Olam Haba will tolerate, and that's the word, tolerate. It means it will accept a Yichud pressure, but it has the ability to suspend the Yichud pressure of Atzmusai and allow the Zulu Say to exist as a self-identity, feeling that it's outside of Atzmusai. But it does this in two stages. In order to allow the Zulu Say to exist and not having a pressure on it, a Yichud pressure, but to exist within the parameters of Atzmusai, it has to change. It has to accommodate itself so that it suddenly realizes, the Zulu Say realizes that the Atzmusai is part of him. It has to become self-aware that there's something what appears to be outside, but it's only an appearance of an outside. Atzmusai is not outside, and it has to allow that. It has to therefore put itself in a position through its change that it tolerates the Yichud pressure. And this means the fact that it tolerates is a state of with Atzmusai loves the Zulu Say, and the Zulu Say loves. It is the mood, the emotion of love that covers that eventuality. But in the beginning, before it changes, it's allowed to exist because the Yichud, God himself suspends the pressure of his Yichud. He suspends it in some way. We have no idea how he does that. And what he does is he creates an appearance of himself called the Ein Sof, which tolerates the suspension of the Yichud pressure. In other words, God, Atzmusai, tolerates the Yichud pressure in his form of Ein Sof. when he's in the form of Atzmusoi, he does not tolerate it. But by changing his form, called the Ein Sof, it tolerates the existence of the Zulu Say, even though there exists Yichud Pressure. So it creates the possibility of toleration that he grants to the Zulu Say through his appearance of being an Ein Sof. Now I realize this is very deep stuff, but this is called the Midas HaChesed. The Midas HaChesed is the toleration of the Yichud Pressure without the contribution of anything that the Zulu Say does. The Zulu Say does nothing to earn this. Chesed is the toleration of the Zulu Say against the Yichud Pressure. But God decides that not only does he want to tolerate through Chesed, but eventually he wants to change that Chesed, the toleration, he wants to change it to something that the Zulu Say does. In other words, the Zulu Say has to earn. It has to manufacture this possibility of the toleration within Yichud Pressure so it doesn't go out of existence. And this activity by the Zulu Say to masaken this flaw, which is called Nam Deksufah, is the way the Zulu Say earns the toleration of the Yichud Pressure on it by its own efforts. So therefore, we understand the concept of the Atzmusoi and its toleration through Hesed and Din. First through Hesed and then Din. But what Din, the essence of Din means, is that there's something that the Zulu Say has to do to earn that toleration. That's something that the Zulu Say has to do. And what does it have to do? It has to do change. It has to change in some way. It has to change its awareness, which sees God as a you, and then suddenly its awareness sees God as a inner me. And by changing this, by developing a love of God for the commandment of Hashem Lakacho, that it loves God, it will earn that change by its own efforts. So therefore, the Buddhism has to create the possibility of change and the possibility of, therefore, the tikkun of Nam Deksufah. Without that, without allowing the possibility of change, the Zulu Say has to rely on the Midas HaChesed to exist, because it needs something to counteract the Yichud Pressure. So in order to counteract that, it must change by itself. It has to undergo change. So God has to introduce the possibility of change. And he introduces that possibility for the Zulu Say to change by creating another appearance of himself called the Ein Sof, which allows the possibility of change.
Rav Shimon, I'm sorry, is there any Yichud Pressure from the Levush, from the Ein?
No, well, there is the Yichud Pressure, but it's contained in the Midah of Chesed. The Ein Sof contains the Midah of Chesed. That's why Chazal say that Atzmusoi created the Zulu Say. There's too much noise on this thing. Atzmusoi created the Ein Sof, and the Midas as it created the Ein Sof, it created the Midas HaChesed, which means that the Midas HaChesed of the Ein Sof now allows the Zulu Say to exist and to counteract the Yichud Pressure. So in other words, the Yichud Pressure is still there. The Yichud Pressure against the Zulu Say is coming from the Ein Sof. It's coming from Atzmusoi, and it's going through the Ein Sof. But the Ein Sof has a certain power that it can temporarily suspend the action of the Yichud Pressure, so that it allows the Zulu Say to change itself, to see God not as a you, but see God as an inner me. And as it changes the view of God in itself, it's subject to change. Suddenly, the Yichud Pressure permanently can tolerate the Zulu Say. So that's the difference between Chesed and Din, and that's why Din is much greater than Chesed. Because Chesed can only temporarily suspend the Yichud pressure of Atzmusai. Din can permanently suspend it, because it creates a toleration of the Zulasai towards the Atzmusai. The Ein Sof is the intermediary that negotiates a fixed toleration of the Yichud pressure from the Atzmusai. So, the way I see it, that's the function of the Ein Sof. That's the function of the appearance of God as a Malbush called the Ein Sof. It's to create the possibility of change. So therefore we see it a very powerful concept that change is the ultimate reason of the creation of the change is the ultimate dynamic for the creation of all of Olam Hazeh. Olam Hazeh, which is the place where the Zulosai earns the tikkun of Nam Deksufah, it earns it because it has suddenly the ability to change. And that's the ability of Din, as it exists in the Ein Sof. The Ein Sof, in essence, is a manifestation of Chesed to allow the manifestation of Din. And that's why the Ein Sof was made from the Atzmusai, to provide the opportunity of a temporary suspension of the Yichud pressure to a midah called Chesed. It has the midah of Chesed to allow the possibility of Din, where the Zulosai can change itself. But in order to do this, the most important thing that the Ein Sof has to do is allow the shirish of Din, which is the shirish of earning it. And that's the concept of change. So how does the Ein Sof create change? How does it do that? Well, it's able to create change because it's a rotzen. In some way, it has a certain concept of an outside, because it has the notion of I want. The Ein Sof says I want because it's the rotzen. It has a will. The Ein Sof was given a will, whereas Atzmusai has no will. And with that will, it says I want, and what it wants is fundamentally to do what? It wants to change the Zulosai so that it can create a fixed toleration against the Yichud pressure. That's the way I defined it. That the Ein Sof is the appearance of God that allows the Midas HaChesed to work. It is a function of the suspension of the Yichud pressure on the Zulosai, so that suddenly, as it's suspended to the Midas HaChesed, the Midas HaDin can work. So the Midas HaDin, which allows the Zulosai to change, requires the Midas HaChesed to temporarily suspend the Yichud pressure. Otherwise, that's impossible. So the Ein Sof therefore allows the possibility of change. That's why all the spheres, which is the mechanism of change, exists in the Ein Sof as a total unit called Akudim, but exists in the Ein Sof. So that we understand very clearly what the Ein Sof is and why it was derived from Atzmusai. It was derived to manifest the Midas HaChesed temporarily, to withhold the Yichud pressure and counteract it, so that the Midas HaDin can become dynamic and functional. And by the Midas HaDin becoming functional, it allows the Zulosai to mesaken this problem of the Yichud pressure. And this problem of Yichud pressure is called Nam Deksufah. So the ultimate goal of Olam Hazeh is to allow the possibility of the tikkun of Nam Deksufah, but first it has to allow the possibility that change is possible. And then it can allow the possibility where the Zulosai exercises this change to what? To mesaken, to heal the problem of Nam Deksufah, which is a problem where the Yichud pressure opposes the Zulu Say by its very nature. So you're looking at a very deep picture. You're looking at a picture of the Atzmusai. That Atzmusai exerts Yichud pressure against anything which can be possibly an outside. That when God derived this, when Atzmusai derived the Zulu Say, it instantly became subject to the concept of Yichud pressure. So therefore, Atzmusai had to suspend its Yichud pressure temporarily and allow the Zulu Say to do it on its own, to counteract the Yichud pressure on its own so that it becomes a permanent toleration. It has to develop a fixed toleration permanently so that it can survive the Yichud pressure of the Atzmusai. Because Yichud pressure always exists. It exists from the entity called Atzmusai, who is not really an entity. But the existence of Atzmusai always exerts the Yichud pressure against the possibility of an outside. And there's nothing that can counteract the pressure of Yichud of Atzmusai. So temporarily, the Atzmusai takes the appearance of an Ein Sof, of a lesser manifestation of God, which is considered the will of God, a Ratzon. And the will of God now contains the possibility to derive the Zulu Say so that it can change. It's the Ein Sof which creates the possibility of change. When God appears as an Ein Sof, an Ein Sof, he creates the possibility of change for the Zulu Say so that it can tolerate the Yichud pressure on a fixed basis. It is no longer confronted by the Yichud pressure or the problem of Deksufah. And how does it do that? It does that through love. But what I am talking about is a very strange concept. I am explaining why God derived the Ein Sof to begin with. So fundamentally, we see a tremendous concept. We see that the only two real entities in existence is the Atzmusai and the Zulu Say. Those are the only two things. Now, why Atzmusai creates the Zulu Say, we don't know. But what we do know is through the midah of Hesed, through the midah of Hatova, you see it. That's why Atzmusai is referred to as Tovi HaMeitev. He wants to do good. But what does that mean, Tovi HaMeitev? It means that he wants to give the Zulu Say the ability to always remain in existence by suspended his Yichud pressure so that the Zulu Say can tolerate the Yichud pressure. And the only way the Zulu Say can actually tolerate the Yichud pressure is by the truth of what? Of change. The truth that it has to become responsible for removing the problem of Deksufah. It has to masaken its Deksufah. And it can only do that if it can change. And therefore, this is called Din. So the Ein Sof exists to permit the possibility where Hesed temporarily exists and converts the Din when the Zulu Say itself earns that possibility of the toleration and a counteracting force of Yichud pressure. So therefore we see that the fundamental concept of all of Kabbalah is how does Hesed turn into Din? How does God refer to as Hagadol, which refers to his midah of Hesed? The midah of Hagadol refers to the midah of Hesed of the Ein Sof. And that midah has to change into Gibor, Hagibor, where now the Ein Sof turns into a different being with a different characteristic called Gibor. Gibor is the name of the Ein Sof as it refers to its creation of Din, change, where the Zulu Say earns the possibility itself for doing that. So now we see an amazing thing. We see how the Ein Sof is the manifestation or the appearance of God that is called Hagadol, exemplifying the midah of Chesed, and is also called Hagibor. It exemplifies the midah of Din. Chesed means there is no change. that it's not done by the Zulu Say. He is not Masakin his Nam Deksufah. But Din means he is Masakin Nam Deksufah. He himself has done that. And he does that because now the Ein Sof has the characteristics of Hagibor, the concept of what? Of Din. And Din is only possible where there can be change. Why? Because the Zulu Say has to obtain a certain fluidity, an ability to change to Masakin Nam Deksufah. And if it doesn't have that possibility, Hesed can last only so long in time. But it's clear that Atzmusay has no intention of creating the world through Hesed. Hesed is a temporary characteristic, it's a temporary function of Atzmusay through the Ein Sof that allows the Zulu Say to exist temporarily against the Yichud Pressure. But suddenly the Atzmusay navigates the Ein Sof to suddenly exhibit the midah of Hagibor. And in the characteristic called Hagibor, the Ein Sof now tolerates the concept of change. Hence, the concept of Simpson. Simpson is the first time that change becomes possible. When the Ein Sof withdraws itself, which is called Simpson, what does he really do? He allows Din to suddenly be created. That's why that's called the Shirish of Din, the root of Din. The root of Din is Simpson. By the Ein Sof withdrawing, suddenly the possibility of change comes in effect. So change appears for the first time. The possibility of change appears for the first time through the concept of change. Suddenly, the Zulu Say takes on the potential of fluidity so that it can change its problem of Nam Deksufah. But does it have the ability to change? No. All that exists is the possibility of change. After Simpson, the Rishimu and the Kav do not have the ability to change. There is no ability. The Zulu Say has not achieved its fluidity yet so that it can change. But the possibility exists that change should be. How? Because in the world of the Rishimu is the world which creates three fundamental concepts. The essence of the concept of change lies in a certain principle. A person cannot change his nature. If a person is defined or is by his essence, that's his definition. He cannot himself change that definition, because if he could change that definition, he wouldn't be himself. He would lose his identity. So therefore, the law is that whatever the essence of an object is, in the case of the Zulu Say, it cannot be changed by the Zulu Say. So therefore, how is change possible? If the Zulu Say cannot change himself, how can he prevent his eventual annihilation from the Midas HaChesed when it's suspended and suddenly Yichud Pressure becomes totally manifest? How can there be any possibility of Din? So what has to be created is called the Shirish of Din, or the possibility of it, but not the actuality. Din does not become an actual function. Change is not possible. The Zulu Say cannot earn it. It's only possible as a potential. What does it mean, a potential? Because in order for change to change to exist, the Zulu Say has to become a certain element of it. A certain element of the Zulu Say has to become outside of it. The Zulu Say has to suddenly develop an outside. Even though the Zulu Say does not really have an outside besides Atzmusay, it has to develop another outside. What outside? What can be outside the Zulu Say? The answer is himself. Now, what am I talking about? I just said it can't be done. You cannot create an outside of yourself, which is outside of yourself, so you can change it. But the answer is in the capacity of the Ein Sof, being Hagibor, it's able, by Simpson, to suddenly withdraw, and suddenly from that point on, the Zulu Say becomes the Rishimu. Post Simpson, the Rishimu, the Zulu Say becomes the Rishimu. And as the Rishimu, it's the beginning of the possibility, not the actuality, the possibility of din or change. How? Because in that world starts the concept of time, the concept of time, the concept of space, and the concept of action. That's right. These three concepts, time, space, and action, these three words refer to concepts that have to do with change. In order to allow change to take place, you have to have time. Why? Because time means a past, a present, and a future. Well, if you have something, if it exists in time, it exists in the past, that means it's in a certain state. And if there's to be change, it has to exist in another state. In other words, before time, in the past and time, it has the problem of Nahama Deksufah. But at the end, in the future, in the time called the future, this problem of Nahama Deksufah disappears. So that means time allows the possibility of existential change, where the way you exist, your nature, is able to change. So therefore, what the Ein Sof does to the Zulu Say, it puts it in the framework of time, where there's a past, one state, a future, another state. So therefore, time is really nothing more than the possibility of change. And what about space? Space allows the possibility of individuals. How does one individual know that it is separate from another individual? How does it achieve the concept of separation or individuality? An individual knows that it's by itself. It's not the same as another person. How does it know that? Because there's space. The concept that there exists something called space between the two individuals that creates the possibility of multiplicity. The possibility that there's change needs the possibility of multiplicity in a certain sense. Why it needs that possibility? Because in the future, the third midah, which is called rachamim, requires the concept of multiplicity, and we will explain that in the next. But therefore, in order to have two individuals, in order for multiplicity to exist, there has to be an indication of the separation of these two individuals. They are not the same person. And therefore, what exists between the two of them is the concept of space, dimensions. Space, which is an environment, allows the possibility of multiplicity. Time, therefore, allows the possibility of change. Space allows the possibility of individuality, of being separate from another person. And finally, there's a third concept, action. What is action? Well, action is a movement. It's going from one place to another. Where? In time. In other words, as you exist in time, you can actually move through time. How? By the manifestation of an action. And that's called doing something. What does it mean to say you're doing something? It means that you are existing in a time frame where you're going from the past to the future, and you exist in a time frame. So an action is a movement. That's what it is. It's the notion of a movement through time. And how is that manifest? By action, the concept of action. So human beings, therefore, are capable of actions. They're capable of actions that move them through time, from past to the present to the future. So therefore, we see that these three concepts of time, of space, and finally of of action allow the possibility of change. So therefore, once these three concepts have been fundamentally created in the world of the Rishimu, where the Rishimu is the Zulu Say, now for the first time change is possible. But in order to change to become actual, to really have a manifestation where change is not only possible, but it's doable, you can actually change, you have to determine or go to another world. The world of the Rishimu and the world of the Rishimu through after Simpson is not enough, because that world gives you the possibility of the Midas Adin, the potential of the Midas Adin. It's called the Sherish of the Midas Adin. But to go through actual, where these three things, time, space, and action, become real, they take on a reality. And therefore, a new world has to be created. The first world, which is the world post-Simpson, is the world of the possibility of change, the possibility of din, the possibility with the Zulosoi Kamasakanam Deksufah. But it does not mean it has an actuality. It still can't do anything. And that has to be done in another world, which completely allows the separation of the Zulosoi from itself. Now, what does this mean, that the Zulosoi separates from itself? Well, I don't have a clarity on that. But that has to be, because in order for the Zulosoi to change, it has to have the ability to choose. Change means to go from one direction to another, which means that there has to be the concept of two possibilities. In order for change to occur, there has to be two possibilities, A or B. And suddenly the Zulosoi will choose either A or B. And in doing that, through his free will, he chooses to change. But that change has to take place in his being, which is outside of him. So therefore, what has to be created is an outside for the Zulosoi himself. In other words, when the Zulosoi exists with the Atzmusoi, it has no outside. It barely has an outside. And that outside is called the reality of its awareness. It has an identity, and that identity is its outside. But that's it. It cannot do anything. It has no action, no time, no space. It cannot do anything. It only is. It exists. The fundamental property of the Zulosoi is to exist. And that does not exist by Atzmusoi, because Atzmusoi represents God and his existence together as an absolute unity. But in the Zulosoi, there's a slight separation. So we say that the Zulosoi exists, but that's all he has. He cannot change, but he exists. But in the world post-Simpson, the possibility of change, because time, space, and action are created. So therefore, to give the actuality of change where suddenly change is possible, there has to be choice. And in that world is called Adam Kadmon. That's suddenly a place where choice is made, where the possibility of choice being made, because the choice that he makes, the Zulosoi makes, is outside of him. So somehow what Atzmusoi did through the Ein Sof, through the appearance of the Ein Sof, is create an outside for the Zulosoi, so that he changes his outside by making a choice of one of two options. And so he changes. So there has to be two options, one, and there has to be the ability to literally locate one, choose one. But that can only be if the change that he has to make is outside of him. It has to be non-integrated. It has to be separated from himself. In other words, suddenly there's a duality of the Zulosoi, where he is himself and he has an outside of himself. And what is that? That's his nature. In some way, the nature of the Zulosoi was externalized from him. How that happened it is an absolute mystery. But this is what the Rabbi Shem had to do to allow the possibility of choosing. You cannot choose that which you are. You cannot change your nature. So therefore, in order to choose, something has to become of you that you aren't. So suddenly you have to develop an inside, which is you, and an outside, which is not you. And that's called non-integration. The Rabbi Shem has to segregate the Zulosoi into two parts. The part of the Zulosoi which makes the choice, and the part of the Zulosoi which is the choice. And that's what's going on. And that world is called the world of Adam Kadmon. And that's the world of the creation of the spheres. What are the spheres? The spheres are nothing more than the Zulosoi that's outside of himself. That's the definition of the spheres. They are the Zulosoi, but outside of himself. Because the Zulu Say has a duality. It has two parts. The part of himself, which is called the inside, and that is his self, and the part of him which is outside of him, which is called the part that can change. It's subject to the manifestation of a choice. It's either A or B. So it's either A, Yeshua Mavadoi, me and you, or it's B, me and enemy. The choice of the Zulu Say is what? Is either what exists is me and you, where God is outside of him, or me and enemy, where God is inside of him. But that choice, the manifestation of that choice, is derived by a reality which is created, which is now outside of the Zulu Say. You see. So therefore we see that world is called the world of Adam Kadmon. And the world of the Adam Kadmon is the appearance of the spheres. The spheres really suddenly begin to appear, and that's called the Zulus, and that's called the world of Adam Kadmon. So therefore now time, space, and action become real, they become functional, they become dynamic, because they exist. And the Zulu Say exists in a dual form called inside out. The inside is the part of the Zulu Say that chooses the self, and the outside is the part that's chosen, which is non-integrated, which is separated from him. And that is equivalent to the creation of the spheres. The spheres are fundamentally created by the Ein Sof. The Ein Sof, in fact, was made for the specific purpose of constructing the spheres. And the spheres allow the possibility of change to become the actuality of change. In the world of the Rishimu, there's only a possibility where time, space, and action are created to allow that possibility, but not that reality. But change becomes a reality. Fluidity of the Zulu Say becomes a reality when the Zulu Say becomes a duality, when he has an inside and an outside. So now he can choose between what his inside will be. He looks at his outside and sees A, choice B, and he says, I just want choice B. So then choice B is then reintegrated into himself, and they become one. And that possibility now becomes his reality. That becomes his nature. So what's happening in the whole Kabbalah is really the Zulu Say turning from just an inside being with a monicity, no duality, where he is himself, but he still has the problem of Deksufah. And then suddenly becomes a duality of an inside and outside, where he can choose what he wants to be. You have to fix this. Okay. Do you understand this? This is very deep. Why? Because change cannot happen. Atzmusa has no shaykhs to change. It has no shaykhs to anything outside. Hence, God says, I never change. It's not possible to change. Because I am outside. There's no reality outside of me. And therefore, I cannot change. And not only that, nothing can be outside of me. Einoid. So when I create a Zulu Say, there's suddenly something that appears to be outside, and as a problem of my Yichud Pressure, that comes from my possibility of creating something outside of me. So how do I get rid of the Yichud Pressure? How do I, not get rid of it, Atzmusa says, how do I allow the Zulu Say to tolerate my Yichud Pressure on a permanent level? So first I would have to do it on a temporary level by creating an appearance which allows Hesed, Tov. And that means that the Zulu Say can exist outside of me, even though there's Yichud Pressure on it. Because I will allow him to tolerate it temporarily. But I have to turn the Zulu Say into an entity that can tolerate my Yichud Pressure permanently, and that can only happen if the Zulu Say chooses it. It's because then he becomes it. So therefore, I have to create a new universe. I have to create the universe of Simpson and then the universe of Adam Kadmon. I have to create two worlds which will allow the possibility of change. But that requires that the Zulu Say becomes a dual figure, an inside and outside. where the inside is the one who chooses and the outside is what's being chosen. And then later on, I have to then reintegrate. So therefore, I have to do three things. I have to deintegrate, where I separate the two, inside and outside, and then I allow the action to take place, which is the choice. And then I have to reintegrate. I reintegrate the inside and the outside of the Zulu Say. And of course, once I reintegrate him, that's Olam Haba, because he will have earned the actuality of tolerating my Yichud Pressure. But I have to create two worlds on this. Well, first of all, I have to create the whole concept of, I have to take on a whole new appearance. I have to take on a new appearance. Because in my state of Atzmusoi, you see, I have nothing else, and I have no time, I have no action, I have nothing to do with these things. I have nothing to do with change. So I have to create an appearance of myself that is capable of doing these things, and that's called the Ein Sof. And the Ein Sof is created to allow the possibility of change in the Zulu Say. But to create the possibility of change in the Zulu Say and to create the actuality of change, I have to deintegrate. I have to separate two parts of the Zulu Say so that now it's a reality. And then I have to give the concept of time, space, and action the ability to act, to be dynamic. So the world has to go from a static position, which is the world right after Simpson, which allows the possibility of change, but not the actuality of it, to the actuality of it, where now the world becomes dynamic. So the first time the world becomes dynamic is the world called what? Adam Kadmon. And that's the world of the spheres. The spheres are the mechanism which allow the possibility of change. That's what they are. Because through the action and interaction of the spheres in all its ways, change can take place. That choice takes place in the Zulu Say. And after choice that takes place in the Zulu Say, then change takes place in the spheres. And when change takes place in the spheres, then suddenly there's change takes place in the Zulu Say. So therefore, that's a reciprocal motion. The choice of the Zulu Say institutes the change in the spheres, and the change in the spheres institutes the manifestation of the Zulu Say. So it suddenly becomes reintegrated. This is the essential operation of all Kabbalah. So the macro structure of Kabbalah is not simply the spheres. That's only one small part. And it's not simply the concept of what? The spheres and the concept. And it's also not simply the concept of Zulu Say. It's partly has to do with Zulu Say, because the Zulu Say is a major component of Atzmusoi, of what he wants, through the Ein Sof. But the most important aspect is now a new macro structure. There's a higher structure that explains the Kabbalah beyond the Zulu Say and beyond the concept of spheres. And what is that? The concept of Hesed to Din. Hesed has to turn into Din. The temporary suspension of my Yichud Pressure has to become permanent, where there's a toleration for my Yichud Pressure. So therefore, my Midas HaChesed has to turn into Midas HaDin. And how do I do that? I do that by creating an appearance called the Ein Sof, which is doable, because the Ein Sof has the ability to create the spheres, which is the mechanism that allows change. So therefore, the concept, which is a part of the macro, the concept of change is above, in a certain sense, the structure of Zulu Say and above the structures of change. So fundamentally, the ultimate macro structure that we see now is the notion that God creates the Zulu Say, and God wants to help it to change itself so that it can tolerate the Yichud structure, the Yichud pressure. That's the fundamental concept of Kabbalah. How do I get? Atzmusoi says, how do I get the Zulu Say to survive my Yichud pressure? That's it. How do I do that? By institution, by first doing the midah of Hesed, and then the midah of Din. But I can only do this by changing my appearance, because I myself, Atzmusoi, have nothing to do with anything. So therefore, I will create a form of me, an appearance, that, what do you call it, that sustains the possibility of change, because it's my Ratzon. So therefore, I will create a manifestation of my Ratzon, and then that will create the possibility of the spheres. And then I will create two worlds. I will with Simpson the Ein Sof, and that will create the possibility of Din, time, space, action. And then I will create the world of what? Of the dynamic world of Adam Kadmon, because in that world it's dynamic. Change is possible, but I have to separate the Zulu Say from himself so that he can choose to be something else. That is so far the ultimate macro structure of Kabbalah. That's where the macro structure appears. It appears in that concept of from Atzmusoi, creating the Ein Sof to create the possibility of change, and then separating the Zulu Say from itself in terms of duality, and then eventually, and that becomes Olam Hazer, and eventually reintegrating the Zulu Say to itself, where the outside disappears and it becomes an inside. It becomes the self of the Zulu Say, and that is all called Olam Haba. And in Olam Haba, you have the Zulu Say that does not act. The Zulu Say cannot act because actions is only a part of Din. In Olam Haba, there will be no Din. There will be no Hesed. There will be a totally new reality, and in that reality, the Zulu Say simply is. It exists. It exists as a part, as a part of Atzmusai. So what I've done now is I've gone through all the major components of the Kabbalah, which is higher than spheres, which is higher than the Zulu Say. It's the concept of changing the Zulu Say so that the Zulu Say can tolerate my Yichud pressure. That is the most important idea of the whole Kabbalah. And that's what creates the idea of God being Hagodoil and Hagibor. But wait a minute, there was one more concept, isn't there? It says Hagodoil, Hagibor, Hanoira. Well, wait a minute, what is Hanoira? Hanoira is the Midas Harachamim. So the question is, what does this have to do with toleration? How does the Midas Harachamim allow the Zulu Say to tolerate the Yichud pressure in Din? Because if the Zulu Say does not choose the right choice, the world is annihilated. The Zulu Say is annihilated. So unless the Zulu Say earns the possibility of toleration from the Yichud pressure, it cannot exist. So what's Rachamim? How does the Rachamim, which suspends the Din, how does it allow it to exist? Not only that, it becomes part and parcel of Olam Haba. So we have to understand the whole concept of Midas Rachamim in terms of our new macro structure. We have to understand it from its root, or try to do that. And that's what I will do next week, the next time we speak. Okay, this is a very deep share, and I apologize for the depth of this share. And you may have to go over this a number of times to truly understand it. Any questions?
Hello, Reb Shimon.
What's that?
I'm a bit, just the whole share today, you were focused on the source of Nahama the Deksufah being Yichud Pressure. Yichud pressure,
yes.
Meaning the Yichud from that Atzmusai is so powerful. That pressure is the source of Nahama the Deksufah. Going back the last many shurim, right, a year ago and all that, you focused the source of Nahama the Deksufah, an internal chulsha of the Zulu Say, the duality.
Right.
So which one is it?
But I didn't tell you the bottom line. The bottom line is why when the Zulu Say says me and you, why can't that be tolerated? I mean, why is that non-Deksufah? Why is that a problem? I never said anything about that. I simply said that non-Deksufah is the me and you dichotomy of the Zulu Say. And I said that has to be fixed. So it's not me, you, it's me, it's me, enemy. That's what I said. But I never explained why it has to be that way. Olam Haba can only be out of love where there's a me-enemy duality. It cannot sustain the duality of me-you. But I never explained why. But now what I'm doing today is I'm giving you the structure which is even above that. It's a hyperstructure. It goes above that. Why? Because fundamentally, the one enemy that the Zulu Say has, and I hate to call it enemy, but in a certain sense it's an enemy because it wants to destroy the Zulu Say, is what? What wants to destroy the Zulu Say? How is the Zulu Say destroyed? Through the Midas Hadin. And how does the Midas Hadin destroy the Zulu Say? The Zulu Say. How? The concept of Yichud Pressure. That's it. Yichud Pressure is the enemy of the Zulu Say, because unless the Zulu Say frees itself from the Yichud Pressure temporarily through Hesed and permanently through Din, it's finished. It disappears. And that's the difference.
So really the engine starts at the engine of the conflict of the Zulu Say really is emanated from Yichud Pressure.
Yes. The Yichud, no one ever said this. You don't see this at all. But it's Yichud Pressure that emanates from Atzmusoi that will not tolerate anything outside of it at all. Anything which has the flavor of that, it will not tolerate. And even though you can't get rid of it really, because the Zulu Say has a certain self which says me, and me seems to be beyond the Atzmusoi, but nevertheless, it can only tolerate it under the action of Din. Din is the only thing that can allow the Zulu Say to permanently survive. Why? Because of the nature of Atzmusoi. You have to understand who Atzmusoi is and what Atzmusoi. Atzmusoi is such a unity where there's nothing is outside of it, and nothing can exist outside of it. And to have a self-identity, which is somewhat outside of Atzmusoi, is impossible. So how could the Zulu Say survive at all? And the answer is only if the Zulu Say makes that change itself. And how does it do it? Through love, by seeing the Atzmusoi as an inner me. And that's the danger. It's called the contradiction of two subjects. The Atzmusoi is a subject, but it's an absolute subject. No other subject is tolerable. The Zulu Say is also a subject that has self-awareness, but it can exist but it cannot exist outside of the absolute subject. So you have a fundamental contradiction between two subjects. You cannot have another relative subject existing outside of the absolute subject. That causes Yichud Pressure, and that is dangerous. So what the Atzmusoi has to do is allow the Zulu Say to exist permanently by tolerating the Yichud Pressure. And how does he do it? It can only do it through the Midas Hadin, not through the Midas HaChesed. It could do it temporarily through the Midas HaChesed, but only permanently through the Midas Hadin. Otherwise, there's Ibud. You see it. So therefore, how do you create Midas HaChesed? How do you create the Midas Hadin? So the next question, and now that you see you need the Midas Hadin to permit the Zulu Say to exist, how do you create the Midas? How do you create the Zulu Say with the Midas Hadin? How do you do it? How can the Zulu Say change itself? That's impossible. You cannot change your own nature. You are yourself. So you cannot change it. So what God has to do is make the Zulu Say not be itself. It has to make it into a duality. And therefore does it in two steps, by making the possibility in the Rishimu and the actuality in what's called Adam Kadmon. The name Adam Kadmon refers to the Zulu Say in the state where it's able to fix itself. That's the difference between the term Rishimu, where it cannot fix itself, and Adam Kadmon, where it can fix itself. That's why it's called Adam Kadmon, the first man, because that's the world of the spheres. And the medium, the mechanism, the vehicle in which it's able to fix itself, it has to be turned into an inside-outside entity, at least temporarily, and then reintegrated into an inside entity alone. But this is done in the world of Adam Kadmon, through the spheres. The spheres are the mechanism which tolerates that thing. And the Kabbalah has always focused on the spheres, But the spheres is not what you want to focus on. What you want to focus on is the cause of the spheres. Why were they made? And who made them and why? You have to concentrate on the Zulu Say and on the Ein Sof and on the cause of the whole thing called change. But change is not possible for the Atzmusai. But it is possible for what? For the Zulu Say. Only if the Zulu Say becomes a dual entity of inside-outside. So therefore it can choose what it will become, which normally is impossible. And the way it can choose that is by being in the appearance. It puts on the malbush of the spheres. The spheres are the malbush, in a certain sense, the external malbush of the Zulu Say. The spheres are the malbush of the Ein Sof, really, because the spheres come from the Ein Sof. So it's a malbush of the Ein Sof, it's an appearance of the Ein Sof. But it's also the temporary appearance on the Zulu Say, not temporary, permanent. Because in Olam Haba, there's one sphere, two spheres left. Kessin and Malchus. These are two spheres which are left permanently in Nitzchias. Why? Because the concept of Yichud Pressure will always exist. There will always be a Yichud Pressure on the Zulu Say, but it's modified and becomes tolerable through the action of Din. That's why. So therefore, the action of Din is always exemplified. It's represented, in terms of the spheres. The spheres exist when the Zulu Say is separated from itself. It can only be done that way through the spheres. And even in Olam Haba, it has to maintain itself through the spheres. Why? Because it has the concept of outside. In a certain way, unbeknownst to us, the Zulu Say is somewhat outside of God. Not really, because God says, I am you, but you are not me. But the part of God that says, you are not me, refers to the Zulu Say as if it's outside. And that has to be manifested in the spheres. So we suddenly understand the true meaning of the spheres and what they do. They are the vehicle of change. And therefore, this change is permanent.
You're saying that even if a person is able to love God to the max level where he gets rid of all the whole mum, like Moshe Rabbeinu, right? Ish Elokim, he's Zoiche Bedin, and he looks at him as God, as his inner me fully, he's still going to need somewhat of a separation, somewhat the sphere of Kesed to separate.
But why? Because
get rid of that.
But why? Because he is a separation. You're not understanding. He is a separation. The Zulu Say will always be a separation from Atzmusai. How? Because of his self-identity. Because he knows himself, and that constitutes a separation. That constitutes as someone who's outside of Atzmusai in appearance. He's not actually outside of Atzmusai. But God says, you are not me. What do you mean you are not me? I thought everything was you. No, I will allow you to have a self-identity, to know yourself. And that knowledge of yourself in some way is outside of me. And that can only be manifest to the spheres. The spheres are the only thing that can give you that knowledge. The spheres are the only thing that can allow something to think or perceive that is outside of Atzmusai. Even though it's not really outside of Atzmusai, but we cannot understand its contradiction in Olam Hazeh. But it's always the spheres which are a fundamental sign that on a certain level, the fact that you can say me and have self-identity, that ability to say me is outside of God, Kavyochel. It appears that way. And that's the essence of
that's his existence, you're saying. That's Gufa, his existence.
Yes.
To get rid of that, he disappears.
Right.
So our whole existence is really something that's a sheker, because Yichud Pressure is the truth.
Yes, right. It's a sheker.
From the rocks.
It don't really exist.
What?
If Shimon, your mom is turning now into Deksufah into a science. You're turning it into a scientific event. It's incredible.
I know I'm turning to science because I'm finding terms, toleration, Yichud Pressure, Din, Hesed. I'm interpreting all these concepts that we used to say into a completely different thing. Now I'm showing you the panemius of what's going on. What is God doing?
You have to
Why
change
is He
your
doing
name,
it?
Reb Shimon, to Einstein, Professor Einstein of Kabbalah.
Not yet.
That's really...
Reb Shimon, Yitzchak one time wanted to say, Yitzchak a few months ago wanted to say, when we're learning that could be Yichud Pressure is the source of Ava. Meaning the
source of Ava is the source of Ava is the unity between the Zulu Say and Atzmusai.
Right.
That's the source of Ava.
No, because Reb Shimon, your brother Reb Mendel asked, he says, how do you cure Nahama the Deksufah by a concept of creation called love? It makes no sense that something that God created later in the Shtalshalas.
The Zulu Say was not created; it was derived.
No, but love, according to his understanding, love is a concept. It was created later in the Shtalshalas, and he didn't understand how that can be a source of cure to Nahama the Deksufah.
Of course it can. Right.
No, but according to what you're saying right now, it's not. Love is not deriving from the Shtalshalas. Love is the Yichud Pressure.
Right.
It's way up there. Yeah.
Right.
Love is an emotion in the world of reality. In the world of Yichud, it's Yichud itself. It's the emes of the Yichud is love. That's what I'm hearing from you.
Right. That's right.
Wow. Incredible career.
Wow. Okay. Wow. So next time I will turn to the Midas of Rachamim, and we'll see to see what that is and so on.